There are many void ships used by the Imperium, from rogue traders to the Navy, and we know they travel with the aid of a navigator through the warp. But what lets the engine access the warp? How is that power supplied, refueled? Friends, let's find out, and welcome to another 40k video. First we draw on a short quote from Rogue Trader. A warp drive or warp engine is a device that enables a spacecraft to enter and leave the medium of warp space. Warp drives incorporate their own navigational units, able to briefly glimpse into warp space in order to observe its current movements, and from this it calculates a course, with any corrective manoeuvres that have to be made whilst in warp space, and the movement to return to the warp. And now a short description from Knights of Macragge. Up a broad metal stairway, thronged with dead and dying ultramarines, GW stock will be plummeting upon hearing that, she caught sight of the warp engine. It was colossal, a massive metal orb around which spun 3 studded gyroscopic rings at hypervelocity. The metal, which was psyconductive and forged from no ordinary mineral, was meant to shroud the reality-bending effects of the engine, but gossamer strands of unnatural light eked through its seams and made the air around it appear to shudder and vibrate. And now we draw on the Sword of Damocles for a quote. Lucian watched as the toiling crews below completed their work, and the petty officers corralled the cursing men from the service deck. The area below the gallery from which Lucian and Covain observed was a vast spheroid chamber, dominated in the centre by a mighty column from floor to ceiling that resembled nothing less than a vast stalactite, grown so huge it had merged with the stalagmites below. Pipes and valves dominated the column's every surface, clouds of steam and other exhaust gases venting from spitting valves, rivulets of runoff pouring down its flanks to pool in great steaming oily lakes across the deck. I've always hated this, Lucian said. His son nodded in agreement with his words. Of all the practicalities of void faring, replenishing the warp drives had always been the task he loathed the most. It was quite unlike the taking on of the fuel required by the Oceanid's myriad plasma generators, although thankfully it was only rarely required. With the imminent crossing of the Damocles Gulf, all of the Crusade's capital vessels had been replenished, with only the rogue trader vessels remaining to be tendered. The wailing of a siren filled the deck, accompanied a moment later by a low crash of the Harlot's umbilical probe, locking with the service deck's airlock. Warning lights flashed as the airlock equalised, atmosphere venting from its release valves in angry plumes. Lucian watched intently, for he knew what to expect next. He heard Covain mumble a low spacerer's prayer. A low ramble filled the service deck, and the airlock's armoured door rose, a cloud of thick mist escaping to creep across the deck. As the door receded into the bulkhead above, Lucian could just make out the silhouettes within. A droning canticle emanated from the airlock as a number of figures emerged from the mist. Soon a column was snaking its way across the service deck. A funeral procession, the mourners carrying upon their shoulders great lead caskets glittering with etheric frost. Those figures were, even to Lucian, who had seen some horrific sights in his time, disturbing in the extreme. Each wore long robes of woven, gunmetal grey, metallic thread, and perhaps it's their fashion choice that disturbs Lucian in the extreme. These people also wore thick lead gloves upon their hands. The robes were dotted with valves, to which long pulsing cables were attached, each coiling behind the bearer to disappear into the airlock behind. The head of each bearer was bared, but their eyes, ears, nose and mouth were fitted with the same valves that covered the body, forcing this poor person to look like they were about to drop. Lucian could see that the bearer's hands, though protected by the thick mitts, gave off an oily smoke, as did the side of the face of each bearer that was closest to the casket. He smouldered. Small humanoid creatures walked at the side of each bearer, vat-grown cyber constructs, monotasked to the whims of their masters. The contents of each coffin-shaped casket was evidently hazardous in the extreme, For Lucian could see, even from the gallery on which he and Corvain stood, the flesh of each bearer slowly cooking, sloughing from his face to reveal muscle and bone beneath. As the procession wound its course across the curved deck below, Lucian watched the tech adepts of his own crew as they worked upon the many dials and levers mounted around the base of the great column at the centre of the chamber. Lucian knew that the tech priests would have prepared long and hard for their task, for it was the most perilous operation a vessel could undertake, including, Lucian mused, actual combat. The consequences of a mishap were scarcely worth considering, and would cost Lucian and his crew far more than their ship and their lives. The procession neared the column, and Lucian could see that the bodies of each bearer were beginning to disintegrate as time wore on, the pulsing of the hundreds of cables snaking behind growing more rapid. Lucian presumed some alchemical concoction that prolonged life was fed to them, perhaps nuke cola or roller cola. He mumbled a prayer, as Corvain had minutes before, seeing the open distaste on his son's face. The scene became even more ghastly as the first of the caskets neared the column. Its bearers visibly staggered beneath what must have been a terrible weight to bear. Singed matter trailed behind the bearers, great chunks of burnt flesh having detached from their limbs as they walked. Only the ministrations of the horrific machinery keeping them animated as their bodies, quite literally, fell apart. The small attendants gathered the burnt remains into heavy chests carried between, some of their number. At the last, the bearers of the lead casket lifted their burden high upon arms almost bare of flesh. The casket was pushed forward into a gaping socket in the side of the column, the door of which swung wide as the Oceanids tech priests pulled levers and voiced their prayers to the machine god. With one final heave-ho, the bearers pushed their casket into the waiting maw, the frost encrusting it, vaporizing in a cloud of mist as it was slid home. With a crash, the door swung shut. The bearers collapsed, each lead robe almost entirely empty. With an obscene sucking noise, the cables attached to the remains of each corpse tightened before snaking back to the airlock, the small attendant gathering up the remains of each bearer before turning back for the airlock. Emperor preserve us, Lucian heard Corvain mutter, and turned to see that his son had developed a severe and quite spontaneous nosebleed. He touched his hand to his nose, unsurprised to see blood upon his palm as he pulled it away. "I've seen enough," said Lucian, knowing that his duty as ship's master was done by ensuring that the first of the caskets was safely received, and take that on board, the first. So there will be many more sacrificed in this ceremony, and the text tells us that many more will be delivered over the next few hours. But Lucian had no stomach to watch the scene. He didn't want to see it repeated again. Now it's a lot to go through to refuel a warp drive, and the spares are there for replacing more parts of it, I assume, more fuel is what I'm guessing. But the long ceremony and the use of humans where a machine would be used by any sane person is very in keeping with the Imperium's approach to technology, rejecting it and picking a much harder way to do things. I mean, why use something simple to move the caskets into place? Some machine with leverage when a human's life can be fed into the Imperial machine. So now, friends, I turn things over to you. You know what to do. Drop me a comment down below.